Thank you all for turning out today. You know I'm a great believer in these. Most of you have been to my town meetings before, but if you haven't, with a 32 county district, I try to do one town meeting in every county every year to give us a chance to look each other in the eye. Sometimes with the congressional schedule and other issues I have a little conflict, and a couple of my earlier ones today will be rescheduled. I'll get there. It's just the way things work. We're out for Easter this week and next. We go back. The biggest challenge we face, the single most important requirement, and if you'll bear with me to visit just a little bit about what's going on back east, then we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, which is the real reason we're here. The biggest challenge we face is doing the appropriations process, funding the federal government for the coming year. Not a whole lot other than that's going to happen, and we'll talk more about this too in a moment if you care to. But with the presidential campaign, and many of you have heard me use the phrase the presidential silly season before, that every 4-year process when, almost 40 people this time lost their mind and decided they wanted to run for president. We've now got 5 actively in the field. All of the political oxygen back east is essentially gone from there. It's going to be difficult to get much of anything productive done. We do have to do the appropriations process. And it's challenging this time. Maybe the way to explain this is, and if you'll accept my Roger Mills County, Oklahoma definitions, you don't have to agree with them, just accept them for a moment. But the environment is not only the presidential campaign, but you've got a divided government. By Roger Mills standards, you've got a very conservative Republican House. You got, by Roger Mills County definitions, a liberal president. You got a United States Senate where even though Mitch McConnell, the Republican, is the majority leader, in fact, he has 54 votes. And under Senate rules, to make anything happen, you have to overcome the unlimited debate, the filibuster option. It takes 60 of the 100 senators to vote, to politely tell a senator to be quiet so they can then vote procedurally with 51 of the 100 to decide then to actually vote on a bill, which would then pass with 51. So you've got to have 60 to get 51 to get 51 to do something. So that means that Senator McConnell has to have his 54, and he's got to persuade 6 of his fellow senators who are Democrats to vote with him. And that's kind of a challenging issue. So, liberal president, conservative House, in fact, nobody really in control in the Senate. That's the environment. Throw on top of that, in addition to the presidential silly season, the huge turnover in membership. 40% of the Republican conference has only been there 2 terms or less. We've got a huge number of members who have a very limited experience in the process, very limited field of view, which doesn't matter, I suppose, on a lot of things, except if you want to do farm bills, or you want to do defense bills, or you want to do transportation bills. If you want to do stuff that requires a lot of thoughtful, careful consideration, it's harder in an environment where so many members simply have no background. Now, I like new faces, don't get me wrong, but you hire managers to be able to manage. Makes it more challenging. So that's the lay of the land there. And as we come into this budget process, we are dealing with 3 votes last fall. One, actually basically 2 that matter the most. One that dealt with a budget agreement to set the spending limits for this year and next year. And then an omnibus appropriation that funded the federal government for bookkeeping year 2016 through the end of the bookkeeping year, which is the last day of September 2016. Well, now we're starting the process to work through this year. Normally, under the 1974 Budget Act, and I promise you this is too much detail, but just bear with me for a moment. The budget law from 1974 says each House and Senate should pass a budget resolution and reconcile the differences. Doesn't go to the president. If we work out our differences, that sets the overall spending and prioritizes how the money's spent. You follow that then with 12 actual appropriation bills that write the checks. We are in a big debate within the Republican ranks in the House over how to do a budget resolution, because the budget resolution passed 1 year ago set spending at this level. In order to actually finish the year up last year, and to get consensus and get things signed into law, the spending level was turned up slightly. And now we're debating, do we fund this year at the agreed to level in December, Some of my colleagues want to go back to the year-old number. The irony is the difference is about $30 billion out of a $4 trillion budget. And no one argues about the new money that was agreed to in December for the Department of Defense. It's this amount that goes to non-defense spending that's the real struggle. At some point, we either have to agree to a budget resolution or deem something to happen, or there's a date, as I understand it, in maybe April or May, when under the budget law, the appropriators can begin to move forward. But doing the appropriations process is important, because not only does that determine how your money gets spent on everything from the federal part of education to defense, the federal part of transportation, the federal part of agriculture, federal part of education, all these things, but it's also the way that you provide guidance. I think that's the phrase I'll use, guidance to the administration, because it gives you the ability in amendments and riders on appropriation bills to restrict spending on certain things or reallocate spending in other areas. If you don't do the appropriations process, then we do something called a CR, which is basically just whatever was going on last year continues on for the next year. Oh, and did I mention the presidential silly season? You've got an administration now that's 10 months, 2-3 weeks left in their term of office. We'll have a new president in January of 2017. I don't know who he or she will be, but we'll have a new president. And that brings us to the next element here. President Obama, when he first came in, essentially had, not all of, but most of his first 2 years in office, he had 60 Democrat senators. He had a supermajority under Speaker Pelosi. That's when we got what many people refer to as Obamacare, national health care. That's when the cap and trade bill, dealing with the consumption and the production of energy and how much regulation the federal government could have, barely passed the House, and the Senate, fortunately, lost their nerve and it wouldn't go forward. Then the president lost his 60-seat majority in the Senate. Remember, Scott Brown of Massachusetts won the special election after Senator Kennedy died. And then ultimately they lost the House, and then they lost the Senate. So the president, not since that first 20 months or so in his term, the first 2 years, has been able to move his legislative agenda. And he's coming down, as my late grandfather would have said, the short rows. It's down to the end of the administration. There are many of us who believe that the tendency of this bunch towards using rulemakings and executive orders to do what they can't get Congress to pass laws to do, at some point there's going to be a burst of these to complete the president's agenda, whatever that may be. Now, if you think that's a possibility, there's two scenarios that plays out here. One, if he assumes that a successor that he likes is going to win, he'll show great restraint until Election Day. Why jeopardize his successor's election? But if he believes that the successor, whoever that may be, can't be elected, then we'll get a burst of these things pretty soon, because they'll try and lock as much of it in as they can before they go home in January 17. And if we don't have an appropriations process, I'll go back to that again, then we can't use the power of the purse to cut some of these things off. So while legislatively there's not a lot, I suspect, that's going to happen in calendar year 2016, there may be a lot of things that happen in the final months of this administration. And in all fairness, all presidents in their final term, in their final year, are focused on having their way, getting their way. So that's out there in the mix. What else is going on? And humor me for a moment. It's a challenging time in the 3rd District of Oklahoma. Ag prices are down 30% from a year ago. Cattle prices are down probably 40% from the high a year and something ago. But understand, that was an amazing high. That was not a normal level. An amazing level, but they're down. Oil and gas back up in the 30s today. I haven't seen today's quote for what the refinery in Tulsa, Sunoco, will pay for a barrel of crude oil, but it's certainly not $100. It's not $80. It's not $60. Thank goodness it's not $26. Back up in the 30s. But it's put a real strain on people's personal pocketbooks, and you see that now at the state level of government, and you're going to see it at a local level of government. It's just when the prices of the goods and services you sell drop by 30 or 40%, or in the oil and gas business by half or 60%, it puts a real strain on everybody. I would offer you this thought about that. Like a lot of you in this room, I lived through the 1980s. Remember the bust of 82, 83, 84, ag and energy? Land prices in my home community took 15 years to recover. It was the end of the 90s before they started to recover from that. I personally don't see this as being that situation all over again. Why do I say that? The oil and gas situation seems to me is, as much as anything, a combination of a slower world economy, Chinese consuming less than we all expected them to consume, but it's also a deliberate effort by the Saudi Arabians to turn the valves open to pump as much crude oil as is possible, which puts pressure on, one, their religious enemies, the Iranian leadership. Two, it puts pressure on the Russians, who have recently announced, supposedly, they're pulling out of Syria, where the Saudis didn't want them to be in the first place militarily. And the third benefit of all this is they're putting great pressure on the oil and gas industry in the United States. Some might call it predatory capitalism, I believe is the term that he used in class a long time ago. But the Saudis are burning down their three competitors. But the Saudis can't do this forever. I have seen stats that would imply to me that they might have, and remember, the kingdom is the property of the king. All the energy resources are, in essence, the property of the king. They have to have a cash flow to maintain political stability in that kingdom. I've been led to believe that they might have sufficient cash reserves to maintain these prices for 4 years. But no prudent manager, no prudent individual will intentionally burn through all of their reserves. No one's going to go to that point. So at some point, when the Saudis decide they've either accomplished what they can or it's impossible to accomplish their ultimate goal, I expect their production to become more rational. I expect some relief. So I don't think it's going to be 1982 all over again. But we've got a couple of tough years ahead of us. And we have to work through that. On the ag side, what's the underlying problem there? Well, again, part of it is a weaker world economy. As we all know in this room, we're exporters. Since colonial times, whichever part of the country you're in, whichever part of some country we belong to at that time in that area, we've sold our surplus products into the world markets. We're exporters. Weak world demand has hurt us. There's just no doubt about that. But the other thing that's put pressure on the commodity side of the equation, on the grain side, I should say, is what's going on in the corn business. Remember, we had our horrible 4-year drought that put pressure on all of us, that helped artificially drive up the price of all grains. And when the Midwest went through their biggest failure in crop-wise since the 50s, and that ever-increasing mandate under federal law for ethanol to be blended with gasoline, primarily made out of corn, it drove corn up to $7 a bushel. It's no coincidence the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, which is voluntary, it's no coincidence that when corn went to $7, acres started coming out of CRP as those contracts expired. You have 7 million fewer acres in the Conservation Reserve Program now than you did before the drought. That's 7 million more acres in production. And a lot of that was good corn land using now modern technology. My personal opinion is the world economy picks up, demand will begin to take some of the surplus stocks off the markets. At some point, my colleagues in Congress have to think about just how many acres of CRP do we have. But we'll get back to some sort of an equilibrium. But again, in Oklahoma, we're ag, we're energy, and we're Main Street. And when you catch both ag and energy in a vice, it puts tremendous pressure on Main Street everywhere, and state government, and county government, and municipal government. So we'll work our way through that. What else is going on? the things around the world, the ongoing struggle with ISIS and the Islamic fundamental terrorists and all of those folks. My friends, this is a struggle that's not going to end anytime soon. And the fundamental problem here is not so much what we do or we don't do. This is the continuation of a 1,400-year battle between the two divisions of Islam, the Sunnis and the Shiites, who, because Muhammad did not clearly sort out his affairs before he died or ascended, whatever your belief might be, they've been going after each other. That's the underlying root of the Saudi-Iranian hostilities, one Shiite, one Sunni. That's a big part of the internal battle in Iraq to this day between the Sunnis and the Shiites. That's not our fault. But we and the West are caught up in the crossfires of this struggle. And it's been going on continuously for 1,400 years. It's just, it heats up some periods and it cools down some periods. And we're now in the intense part. In all fairness, when the president couldn't negotiate a force agreement with the Iraqis several years ago, probably that got us out too quick and began to unravel the situation. When after Libya, and we helped encourage the removal of Omar Gaddafi, by not creating a clear path there, we've got a situation where the militias in the east of the country are fighting the militias in the west of the country, and the ISIS folks are trying to take advantage of it all. Ongoing chaos and confusion. So I don't have you an answer for that. What else is out there that we can talk about, that we should talk about? For just a moment, the Farm Bill. Hard to believe we're 2 years now into a 5-year Farm Bill. It'll be time to do another Farm Bill and complete it by the end of September 2018. I would suggest to you, remember the 2014 Farm Bill backdated and picked up the first of that year since we passed it mid-year. I would suggest to you that most likely you'll see a 1-year extension. I'm not chairman of the committee anymore. I'm still and will always be a member of the committee. I think Mr. Conaway's a fine fellow. Mr. Peterson, who was my ranking member, still the Democrat on the committee, the ranking member. But just by the nature of what it works, that's a 1-year extension at the very least, and will take us to 2019. But it's going to be a brawl. And it took 2.5 years to pass a bill just to make sure we could raise enough food and fiber that everybody could have access at an affordable price. And that was in a stable time compared to this. It's just going to be a challenge. One common thought about the presidential race when it comes to ag. Do any of them understand ag? Your facial expressions answer the question. That's out there in the mix. Oh, U.S. Supreme Court appointment. Remember confirming justices of all levels of the federal court, and for that matter, officers of the executive branch under the Constitution fall within the jurisdiction of the United States Senate. I understand exactly where the senators are coming from when they say that we should not confirm someone in the final months of an administration, that this should be the pick of the next president. I would suggest this to you, though. Who knows who the next president's going to be? In all fairness, who knows? Do not be surprised, and remember, in the eyes of many of my friends on the East Coast, this is one of the kids talking about the adults. House member talking about the Senate. Do not be surprised if after Election Day, depending on what happens on Election Day, if this present individual doesn't get confirmed as the lesser of evils. Just don't be surprised by that. And that said, let's talk about the presidential stuff for just a moment and throw the floor open. I've been a political enthusiast all my life, and I've been involved in campaigns all my adult life, and I dare any of you in this room to tell me that you've lived through anything this wild and bizarre as this campaign cycle. I mean, there's just nothing to compare. This is wilder than 1968. This is just bizarre. At least on the Republican side, we've gone from 23 candidates down to 3. Thank goodness. The Democratic side's gone from 5 down to 2. But who would have ever guessed 2 or 3 years ago that the 2 candidates who'd be creating the most excitement, I didn't say had the most delegates, but be creating the most excitement, would be a property developer from New York City, Mr. Trump, the huge turnouts in his rallies, and on the Democratic side, it's a socialist from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, turning out crowds. Now, Bernie won't be the nominee, but he carried Oklahoma. He carried my home county. It's just an amazing year. And on the Republican side, you have to assume that the former Secretary of State will be the nominee on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, Mr. Trump is ahead in delegates. And in the way the process works, it's hard to believe he won't be ahead going into convention. Now, will he have outright won it or will he not? There's just at this point, no way to tell. But I would suggest to you, from a Republican perspective, the fascinating thing about Mr. Trump is he's generated a lot of enthusiasm amongst people who've never participated before. They're really fired up. Now, I may or I may not have any Trump supporters in the room today, but in my town meetings in the last couple of months, I've had quite a few around the state, and they're new faces to me, and they're enthused. By the same token, Mr. Cruz supporters, at least who've attended my meetings and indicated, or tend to be party activists, social conservatives. They understand the rules. They've been through the process a whole bunch of times. If it's a convention that has to decide things on the floor, then it better be done in the most careful, upright, straightforward of fashions. Because if anyone thinks they've been rickadooed, I think that's the polite phrase my late grandmother would have used, rickadooed, then it'll blow the bottom out of the party. But oh my. Oh. But no matter what you may think, the wildest convention of my lifetime that, yes, I watched on black and white television as a puppy was Chicago. Some of you might remember those images of the tear gas and all the stuff. No matter how wild a Republican convention is, we're way too boring to have anything that exciting. So it might be wild for us, but it won't be wild by the nature of the process. But in 10 months and a few weeks, you get a new president. You get a new president. And it's time.
Any thoughts on refining relations with Cuba?
Oh, many of my groups are very enthusiastic about this, the opportunity to sell, whether it's rice or wheat or whatever, into the Cuban economy. And clearly the president's very enthused about this too. I personally would have preferred to have seen some change there as we were changing our policies. I'm not sure that the Castro family is quite prepared yet to let anything that resembles a functioning open society occur. But the president's bound and determined, and in the next 10 months he'll use the authorities that he has. He can't completely lift the embargo, but we'll see. The ball obviously now is in the Cubans' court. If they really want to step away from traditional communism, President Obama's put his hand all the way out. The one thing, though, I would suggest to you that probably that concerns Fidel and Raul and the rest of the family is the experience in 1991 of Mr. Gorbachev. Sometimes you can't just make people partially free. If you start to free them, they're going to demand it all. Communism collapsed and the old guard was swept away. I suspect the Castros are very sensitive about that in Cuba. But we'll see. We'll see. Floor is yours, my friends. I don't pretend to know everything. And I've got the most dedicated people, pencil and paper. If I can't answer the question, we'll get you an answer.
Well, I asked why you were up there it's the first full year you were up there. In 100 days, you've done more than this Congress has done all year. Why are those younger ones, why are they more ignorant than you all?
Some of the puppies, Jim, are very idealistic. And to use the old baseball line, they want to hit home runs. If you want to hit a home run every time, What was the observation about Babe Ruth, the first home run king at the early part of last century? He had more home runs than anybody. But if I remember correctly, he also had the #1 strikeout record in the big leagues in the first 50 years of pro baseball. That's the challenge that some of my idealistic friends have. They want to hit a home run every time. In 1995, we had a situation where we had a Republican majority in the House. Yes, we had a Republican majority in the Senate, but there were still a number of senators who were in the South and the West who were Democrats who had very conservative constituencies. David Boren kind of guys. Plus, we also has a president who was in his first term, who done the tax increase, who done the Brady bill, remember the gun control, and almost gotten national health care, Hillary care. Remember, before Obamacare, there was Hillary care. It fell apart. And I think Bill Clinton realized he'd overstepped in his first 2 years. He wanted to stay president, and he figured out to do that meant he had to tolerate us, work with us. I won't say cooperate, but he had to work with us. And that got a burst of all that legislation. And there was a lot of things. I tell people one of the biggest acts passed in that first 100 days that we get no credit for it whatsoever was something called the Congressional Accountability Act. Until 1995, almost every time my predecessors passed the law, they put a line in the bottom that exempted the House and the Senate from it. We weren't subject to the Fair Labor Standards Acts of 1938. We weren't subject to the Americans with the Disability Act. We weren't subject to anything. In 95, one of those pieces of legislation, and how could President Clinton argue with that? He signed it. One of my favorite stories then, and you've heard me tell this before, but there was so much stuff that had to be implemented, it was actually spread out over like 4 years. There was so much stuff that you deal with that we had to come to grips with dealing with. They couldn't do it all at once. And we had an old member in the front of the room who'd been there forever, now long gone. And the lawyers would come in every time we'd do something, and the lawyers would explain, this is what is taking effect on a certain day. And you've got to be prepared for it. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, where they explain to the members that you now have to have a policy handbook on how you deal with your employees. You have to have a disciplinary process. You have to have a hearing process. And you will be subject to wrongful dismissal suits, which business had been subject to for 50 years at that point. But for the first time, it was coming to Congress. And one of the old guys, who, by the way, had voted for the bill, I'll never forget when the lawyers got done, he stood up and he said, who in the Hades passed this crap? Well, one, he didn't know what he was voting on. And number two, he didn't have a clue what everybody else had been dealing with for 50 years. He didn't have a clue. But it was one of those wonderful moments. Now, back to your point question. We had a different president. We had a different scenario. In this situation, Bill Clinton would have made an awesome county commissioner in Roger Mills County. Notice I put that caveat on there. His understanding of people, allocating resources, making things get done. He'd have made a great county commissioner in Roger Mills County, Oklahoma. But he had a practical streak, and he liked living in public housing, the White House. This guy, and I state this as a matter of fact, is a more philosophical fellow than Bill Clinton. President Obama believes his principles. He's very focused on his principles, and he's going to accomplish his principles. There's not much wiggle room there. So when we pass these home run bills out of the House, and we passed hundreds in the last almost 4 years, either they can't get past the filibuster requirement in the Senate, can't get 6 Democrat senators to vote to let them come to the floor, or on the rarest of occasions, 2 or 3, they get vetoed when they get to the White House. What's the Constitution say? It takes 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to make a law, to become law, notwithstanding the president's veto. That's why we look like we're spinning in circles, because the boat doesn't have a rudder, and we are spinning in circles. It's one of the things about this November. Whatever your perspective may be, Somebody needs to be put in control. Pick one side or the other and give somebody the ability to make things happen. Now, a lot of your fellow 3rd District people look me in the eye when I say that and they say, but you mean not much is happening? And then they smile and say, well, we're safer, aren't we? Well, maybe you are to a degree. That's true. But there are problems out there. And the underclassmen will figure this out. You know, more calluses you get in life, the more scratches and scars you have, the better you make your decisions. It's just we all have to wait for them to get calloused up good.
The thing about Clinton, he figured out that he let it go through and then he's going to get credit for doing it.
Oh, absolutely. Welfare reform is a classic example. He vetoed welfare reform twice. The summer of 1996, Bob Dole, who was the Republican nominee, was pounding on him with it. Bill figured out it was a winning equation. And the 3rd time, when we sent it to him, he signed it. Put his arms on the 2 authors and signing ceremony. Now, I will admit to you there was an intense debate that summer in the Republican conference over what to do. Because some of my colleagues said, if we send him this bill, we will guarantee his re-election. And some of my other colleagues said, but if we don't send him this bill and he gets re-elected, we'll never live long enough to have a chance to do this again. And the ultimate discussion was, do the right policy thing or do the right political thing? We did the policy thing. We sent him the bill. Got him re-elected. Now, one of the advantages also of that period, and people forget this, we had 4 years of balanced budgets, 3.5 years of balanced budgets in there. Because when we came in, we slowed down spending, provided stability, the economy grew, and we grew our way back into balance. 9/11, 2001, the War on Terror. Remember, we wrote a $40 billion check after New York City was attacked and the Pentagon and those good people lost their lives in Pennsylvania in that field. $40 billion. George Bush went from a peace president to a war president with complete and total focus. And in a war, of course, you spend what you got to spend because you can't lose. You got to win. But we had 4 balanced budgets. You just have to restrain the growth and let the economy grow. You can't raise taxes because if you raise taxes on the federal level, the body will just spend it faster than it comes in. Just the way it works. Sorry about the philosophical dissertation. I'm a little worked up about the presidential stuff too, as you can tell. By the way, I've endorsed nobody.
Do you believe that a Trump candidacy will put the Senate in play?
I think whoever prevails in the presidential contest will have a Senate majority of their side. So I guess my short answer is I think they all put it in play. If Hillary prevails, former Secretary Clinton prevails. If she prevails, then I would expect by the narrowest of margins to have a Democrat Senate. If Trump would prevail, I would expect a Republican Senate. Now, if it's a close presidential race, how does that affect things? It's just too early yet to tell. We've got to get through this convention process, both on the Democratic and the Republican side, to see what the lay of the land is. So far, like Bernie, to discuss the whole field, Bernie hasn't given up on running, and he's still winning states as he goes along. It's mathematically impossible for him to be the nominee, but what kind of philosophical point does Bernie make at the convention, and how does that affect the other side is one issue. On the Republican side, if Mr. Trump goes in with a winning number of delegates, it's academic, we'll move on, it's a clean fight, one way or the other. But if nobody's quite won those necessary seats, the delegates' votes, and we get to Detroit, it won't be Chicago 1968, but for us it'll be pretty loud and pretty rancorous. Be reminiscent of Reagan Ford in '76, remember? And that certainly had an effect on Jerry Ford. Even though he won, it weakened him. And this is a year when there's so many things that could break at the end. If you had a catastrophe like what happened in front of that American Airlines ticket gate in Belgium in the United States at some point in the fall, that could affect the attitudes. If the FBI director would suddenly make some very strong pronouncement about certain email issues, that could impact the election. On the Republican side, in a normal year, I would say if one of them said something. But what's left to say? They've said it all in every way. It's just what's left.
When that happens, the president will pick up on that law those past years ago that he can take over like Roosevelt.
No. He goes home. He goes home.
For sure.
22nd Amendment reads the way it reads. We will inaugurate a new president on the 21st of January 2017. And if we can't pick a clear winner, remember the Constitution as amended in the 18 teens says if the Electoral College deadlocks, if no one has a majority, say one of the candidates on the Democratic or the Republican side pulls out and runs a third party, picks up just enough electoral delegate votes in just a couple of states to throw the process, Constitution says the House of Representatives will elect the president based on one vote per state. One vote per state. Now in Oklahoma, we'll vote with the person that carries the state. It'll be simple. But think about some of these states on the East and West Coast that have recent times been so close, the Floridas, the Ohios, those kind of places, where you've got a split delegation. They're not all ours, they're not all these. Think about the political brawl that'll set off, Jim. But also remember, we only pick the president in the worst case scenario. Under the Constitution as amended, the United States Senate would pick the vice president based on one vote per senator. So we'll have 50 votes in the House. You know, I say that, I'm not sure what the status of the District of Columbia is. Might be 51 votes. But in the Senate, it'll be 100 votes and they'll pick the VP. So for the first time since the beginning of the country, you might conceivably not have the same party people be pres and vice pres. It's possible. And you say, how do you get there? Well, say Bernie gets unhappy and he decides to run as an independent. He carries Vermont. He maybe gets one or two more idealistic states in the Northeast. Say, even though Trump might have the most delegates committed going into the convention, but are not an absolute majority, the Cruz people understand the party rules. They're organized. And for some of you who've not been involved in party work, both parties have a system by which delegates are instructed based on the caucus votes or on the primary votes on how to vote. But the convention, district or state actually pick the delegates. So it's possible to have a delegate who might be committed to vote for somebody else but is not necessarily enamored with them. Think about that. And under all party rules, after so many ballots, delegates are released. They can vote their conscience. Think about that for a moment. So if you're Trump and you go in to the convention with the most votes, but it's deadlocked, Kasich won't get out, Rubio won't turn his people loose, and you get down to that third or fourth or fifth ballot, depending on the particular state party rules, and the delegates are released, in a what-if scenario. What if the Cruz people have done a good job of electing all the delegates, for instance, even though in a lot of states they're committed to vote for Trump in the beginning? You see where I'm going? On the fourth or fifth ballot? And you remember I mentioned how the Trump people tend to be new people who've not been a part of the process before? How many of them are going to take time to remember that these rules go back to the first Republican convention in 1856? They're going to think they got, to use my grandmother's phrase, rickadooed. Blow the bottom out. So, get ready for a long, wild fall. But one thing about it, if it's Trump and if it's Hillary Clinton, it'll be loud, it'll be shrill, it'll be pointed. It will be reality TV come to the presidential process. Who would have guessed we'd have a Kardashian-style campaign? Whatever that means. Good guess. Sorry about the long answer, but it probably is the single most important scenario on what happens this fall. But at some point we have to come back together. This campaign's been so surreal. I'd like to get back personally to something a little more boring, a little more focused on the issues. But we'll see. It is a reality TV kind of a world. Right now, anyway.
The ongoing spending of this seems like it keeps on going.
Mandatory money, absolutely.
In the economy where it's pretty much in a stalemate, as being able to grow. And then you have sequestering in there in the mix somewhere along the way.
Yep.
Where are we with all that as far as sequestering?
Of the approximately $4 trillion that will be spent in this coming new bookkeeping year, about $3 trillion of it is now mandatory money. Think of Social Security, think about Medicare, in all honesty, the crop insurance programs, the commodity titles are mandatory money too. 3/4 of it's mandatory money. Of the $1 trillion that's not mandatory, that's what we appropriate annually, the way that was envisioned in the Constitution in 1788. Of that, sequestration affects that part. And the way sequestration was put together, it essentially has a disproportionate effect on defense spending. You get a bigger cut out of defense than what's left of the discretionary. That was a part of this deal last fall, was to put money back into defense. My friends on the right and left are not generally arguing about that. But it's that small amount of discretionary that was required to get the White House and the Senate Democrats to sign off that is the blow up. But right now, the ultimate answer is that for all of the reductions in spending we've done on discretionary, we got to look at the mandatory stuff because it's growing at such a rate. I can't quote you the exact number off the top of my head, but it's like 2026, there's no more discretionary left anymore. The mandatory pushes it all out. And you got to spend money on defense. You got to defend yourself. And that's the tough challenge. Now, not all of the mandatory money is alike. Farm bill spending expires every 5 years, so it comes to an end at some point. And I broach this subject carefully because occasionally I get things going here I can't control. But not all mandatory money is alike. Social Security is different than Medicare or the other programs. Now, why do I say that? Social Security was designed in 1935 by an entirely different group of people than who created, for instance, Medicare in 1965. Under Social Security, there's a trust fund, and money comes in every month. And in months when there's less going out than coming in, it gets added to the reserve fund. You buy Treasury bills and bonds with it. We're now to the point where most months more money's going out than coming in, and it goes flat red line shortly. That means more money going out every month than coming in. But under Social Security, when you exhaust the trust fund, now this is 1935 law, when you exhaust the trust fund, what happens is they go to a pay-as-you-go system. I got to give the folks in the 30s credit. I mean, they thought this through. A pay-as-you-go system. So whatever money comes in 1 month from the FICA tax collections will be allocated out the next month. So say you're supposed to get a $100 Social Security check. Now this is a little bit down the road, but not that far. $100 out of the fund. If only enough money came in the month before, once the trust fund's gone, to pay 92 cents, that's all you're going to get. It's going to be prorated out. Or 68 cents. It's going to be prorated out. The logic was, in the 30s, they weren't going to create a system that would bring the whole entire government down. That's Roosevelt, that's the Congress of the time. 1965, Lyndon Johnson and the Congress. Medicare is a true entitlement in that it doesn't matter if there's any money left in the trust fund. If in months, and this comes more critical mass quicker than regular Social Security, if more money goes out than comes in, it says that the Treasury shall, in effect, advance enough money to cover the obligation. In effect, it automatically, you just go into debt to meet the deficiency. Those are the kind of traps that just open up and swallow us alive. So, the great debate is, how do you address these kind of issues? The problem is the biggest things out there are Medicare. The biggest potential issue is Social Security. And those two programs have one of the biggest, toughest, most aggressive advocates that live on the face of the earth. You may think the NRA is tough. You may think the American Banking Association is tough. You might think the AFL-CIO is tough. The toughest, most aggressive, meanest lobbying force is AARP. And their basic position is, don't put one finger on it, don't touch one point to it, don't mess with it on any occasion. Well, that's great. Except somewhere down the road, if you're under 50 years of age, we all implode. And that's why they're so hard. You remember Bush, George W. Bush talked in his second term about adjusting Social Security so that you could take part of the money that you pay in taxes and put it in a TSP or a 401k or get a bigger rate of growth on it. Do you remember how radical that got shut down? On Social Security, I just basically look people in the eye and say, if you don't want to make any changes, when we get to that critical mass point, then we'll figure it out. If you won't let me do something now, at some point on regular Social Security, we'll get there. On Medicare, we're at $19 trillion deficit now. How far down do you have to go before we make a decision? Man, that's an encouraging topic, isn't it? I know I made all you feel better. I don't blame you. Thanks for coming. You know I appreciate that.
The people are in AARP really know what they're getting into.
I don't know. I just get a lot of blast action faxes and phone calls.
Well, I joined
Don't mess with me.
When I turned 55, and it didn't take but a year, and I decided that wasn't the people I wanted to mess with.
When the message starts off, don't mess with me.
Yeah.
And I understand people's concerns. I do appreciate that. And if all the programs were drawn up like original Social Security, it's a self-balancing ship. It'll force us to make decisions. In Social Security's case, those of us born on January 1, 1960 or later, will have to be 67 to apply for the full benefit. That was one of the ways of stretching the resources. Don't be surprised if at some point down the road, full Social Security benefits kick in at 70. Now the great debate otherwise is, what about the early option at 62, where you get 40% of your check? Will that still be there? Those kind of things will be a really lively debate. But for now, and no one wants to allow any decisions to be made, and it still takes the consensus of the House, the Senate, and the President to get anything done. That's one. You remember I made my earlier comment about right now where the conservative House, liberal President, nobody in control in the Senate, they're just kind of spinning in circles. Voters have to decide which way we go, because some things have to happen. Can't just hide from the facts forever. There are a few other things, for instance, that I know get my friends fired up. The Waters of the USA rule, an important issue. It's one of those things where the courts have now basically stated, and by the time the legal battle's over, you'll be into the next administration. So whoever, once again, just as the next president most likely will nominate a Supreme Court justice and place them on the courts, so the next president will sort out the waters of the U.S. too. It's a big decision in November on which way we go as a country. Big decision.
Well, you and they got that passed, to change where our big part of the ocean belongs to us.
Senate's still blocking our participation in the, I forget the name of the treaty, escapes me this moment. Once again, treaty ratification falls under the United States Senate's jurisdiction, so I don't deal with those on a day-to-day basis. Law of the sea or something like that, it's called. Several of those things out there floating around. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Congressman Lucas, I noticed some months back ago you voted in support, or maybe you co-authored a bill to open up for the selling of U.S. oil in the world market.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me how it is, and I think that's great, I've only heard good things about it, but I don't understand, so it's how that helps the price of oil in the economy. Last time I knew, oil was way too low. And it's too low because of a supply glut.
Mm-hmm.
So taking all of the U.S. mined oil and releasing it into the world market seems like it might have the effect of driving the price even lower.
Well, go back to the why the ban was put on in the first place. 1974, after the Yom Kippur War, the Middle Eastern Arab oil-producing countries basically put a quarantine on us and drove the price to the ceiling. The president of the time at the United States, who was a member of my party, did a quick political shot to say that, well, you can't sell any crude oil out of the outside of the United States. We have to preserve our own stock. Well, at the time, we didn't have any surplus oil. There wasn't any being sold outside the country. It made no difference whatsoever. So advance forward 40 years. You've got the big strikes here in Oklahoma, the dramatic increase, 3D seismographing, horizontal drilling, fracking technologies, all the stuff in the Dakotas and over into Canada, straight north of us up the plains. So now we find ourselves, we're in the center core of the United States. We actually have more crude oil than we can consume. We've got a surplus. But at the same time, the world economy is slack. The Saudis have cranked up their production, I believe punishing U.S. producers and the Russians and the Iranians. So we got a world glut. The price is down. I don't know personally that exporting U.S. crude oil will help the price that much, but it will clear resources out of the United States, and it will create a positive cash flow coming back into the country. Now, if you're on the East and West Coast, you fought this, because your perspective is not, are we sending our money out of the country? Are we doing a disservice to ourselves by not developing our own resources? The perspective on the East and West Coast is, I want the cheapest possible gasoline I can get, and as long as a multinational oil company can produce it somewhere else and haul it to the refinery in New Jersey or in California, hallelujah. But a big part of our economic challenges in my adult lifetime have been all the money we've sent to Venezuela and to Saudi Arabia, and before the Shah or before the Ayatollah, Iran and all those countries. So I don't know that it brings up the price of crude oil, but I know it clears the market and it creates a cash flow coming back into the United States. And I think those are positive. Up until 1958, we were the world's biggest crude oil exporter. Till the big strikes came on in the Middle East, where they only dig a fourth the distance we do, and they have no environmental rules, and it's a light grade of crude.
Are we still the world's leading importer of oil?
You know, I can't give you an accurate answer to that question. I know we still import it on the East and West Coast. I would say, my gut feeling is that we're not now with what we've brought online here at home. But I can't be certain about that. I'd have to look the stats up. Yes.
You serve on the banking committee. Do you think we'll see negative interest rates as we have seen now in Europe?
We are sliding in that direction. If you look at the level that the Federal Reserve has on the Fed funds rate, on their overnight stuff, they've in effect driven interest rates down to almost nothing. What's a passbook account pay in Alva or in Cheyenne, Oklahoma? It's got a point and about 3 zeros anymore, and then a very small number after that. Will we truly get to the point where the system is managed such that you have to basically pay for the privilege of having a deposit in the bank? I hope not. because I don't think this is good economics. When you have the central banks in the United States and around the world artificially hold interest rates down, that's distorting how capital is allocated. It's been a long time since I've had money in banking in college. But I well remember the quote that for 500 years, real interest rates were 5% plus whatever the inflation was in the country at whatever the time was. 5%. Real interest rates are already at a negative, because if you're receiving 0.1% and the inflation rate probably in truth is running closer to 2, if you have money in the bank, you're already paying a price. But this is not the first time this happened. As a junior taking that money in banking class, I can remember having a discussion with that same grandmother that I've quoted to you a couple times today in 1981, who was so proud of her 13% money market certificate. And I said, "Grandmother, in this particular quarter," I said, "the inflation rate's running at 17%. You're only losing 4 cents on the dollar in real buying power." Oh, that lit her up like a Roman candle. How could you lose money at 13%? But that was the real effect. You remember the Carter years when we tried to inflate our way out of the bind we were in. Now, that didn't work. Created a lot of pain. So now, in the environment of the last basically 8 years, instead of using inflation to buy our way out, we've basically just turned on the printing presses, and that's what that amounts to when you're creating money with those bonding operations. The Germans in the 20s physically ran a press. No, we're creating electronic transactions that do the same thing. This can't continue. It distorts the economy's ability. What are bankers? Bankers are arbitrageurs of capital. They figure out what money's worth, and they pay you and I interest for our deposits. They turn around then and figure what that money is worth in the economy, and they sell that money by charging an interest rate to make a loan. And their profit's the middle. They're arbitraging it. But they allocate the capital. They're willing to pay what it takes to get the deposits, and they're then responsible for making the decisions about who can do the good loans, or who's safe, who's productive. That's why the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. Because remember, instead of a market economy, they had a demand economy. The Central Committee was putting money here and here and here and taking it from here and here and here. Doesn't work. Even the mainland Chinese have adopted the market economy principles in how they're doing their business. They're not doing a very good job of it yet, but they're trying to adopt it, I should say. So, short answer is, I don't see how we can continue down the present path we're on. And technically, you'd say we're not into negative interest rates, but the net effect really already is there. It's really already there. You're losing money if you've saved all your life and you've got it in a nice, secure, guaranteed deposit. But by the same token, and I worry very much about my constituents who are in those twilight years of their lives. Would you put your money in the stock market right now? It pitches like the ocean in a hurricane. I wouldn't tell my mother to do that. So, we have to get back to more rational policies. Again, thank you for coming, as always. And we'll see what happens in November. And hopefully we'll survive November.